Good morning. I really appreciate that introduction. Very humbled by the introduction. We are doing a lot of really neat research, and I would say right now this is probably the coolest thing in young terms that we've ever worked on in my time at the university, and who knows where it'll go from here. So today we have a lot of animations. I encourage you to take a look at those. Luckily, some of the things we're going to be talking about are highly visual, and I think help us to understand and interpret, what we're talking about. I'd like to reiterate a point that Dr. Jones made, which is quality is king in beef cattle. We sell beef because of the way beef eats, and we should never deviate from that, right? The quality factors, the tenderness, the flavor in particular, the juiciness is what differentiates us from our competitors, which are primarily poultry and pork. So we must keep marbling, we must keep quality in the forefront of all of our discussions. However, this 95-5% balance of how we emphasize value and emphasize our production, our genetics, and the way that we manage these cattle is probably a little out of whack, right? And so that's something that we've really needed to focus on moving forward, putting a little more emphasis on what we're now calling red meat yield. Okay, so red meat yield, of course, goes back to something that I can assure you everyone in this room learned, which is the yield grading system. The yield grading system is what we've used to categorize carcasses on the basis of edible portion or red meat yield. Most all of us learned about yield grades 1 through 5 and how that translated to differences in boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts from the round, loin, rib, and chuck. How am I so confident that all of us learned this same concept? Because it's really old, okay? And in fact, this came into play and was officially made official in the very early 1960s, right? So all of us, I would venture to say, have learned this system and have learned it very well over a 65-year time frame. So we get to think about something that's 65 years old in our industry that is left unchanged. It's probably time to change, right? Particularly as technology and capacity with genetics and feeding practices have changed so much over time. So as we take a look at the yield grade factors that go in, things like thickness of fat, particularly 12th rib fat thickness, ribeye area, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, which is that internal fat, and hot carcass weight have been used in this same equation for that time frame to estimate yield of carcasses, okay? So one thing that we understand really well is that if we know red meat yield, not with yield grade, but if we truly understand what red meat yield is on an individual carcass basis, then that is very well related to cutout value. Cutout value is the weight and quality grade of the beef going into the box. In other words, how many dollars are returned. So what these data suggest is there's about a 90% relationship, 89% to be exact, between knowing the red meat yield of a carcass and what it's actually worth, okay? Now that seems like common sense, and to a large degree it is, but remember that just because we put more lean muscle on a carcass, that doesn't directly translate to the most valuable parts of the carcass. For example, in some ways, when we add a whole lot of lean to the hind quarter, a lot of that ends up in ground beef or tenderized cutlets or round steaks that are of lesser value. So that's a big part of the reason why this isn't a perfect relationship, right? It's not a perfect relationship, but it's a really, really strong one. So here's where we get into that yield grade discussion again. If you take a look at calculated yield grade on the left bar relative to the actual red meat yield. So remember, yield grade is supposed to estimate actual red meat yield. The relationship between calculated yield grade to the nearest tenth, in other words, 3.2, 3.4, 3.5, 4.2, is 4%. 4% with true red meat yield. The relationship is dismally low. And to put it in our terms, and all of us have went through schooling, this is making a 4 on a test. Not a 4 out of 5, but a 4 out of 100, okay? So it is not only not accurate, it is miserably failing. It is not accurate at all, to the point where we can't really put any faith in the numbers that we're given. So one of the first approaches that we took, at least on paper and for research purposes, is, well, if we correct the yield grade equation by changing the math, changing the algorithm, and in this day and age, everybody kind of understands what an algorithm is, right? It's a prediction equation. If we change that math, how much more accurate can we get? Well, the good news is we got more accurate by changing those metrics or those coefficients, changing that algorithm, but we only get into the 30s, right? So we get into these accuracies of 19% on dairy cattle, 26% on beef on dairy crossbreds, and only 39% on conventional cattle. So we've improved our ability to do that, but we're still falling well short of where we want to be in terms of individual carcass accuracy. And again, re-emphasizing this point, a scientist by the name of Charlie Murphy at Texas A&M University in the late 1950s began conducting research, red meat yield research, on the current cattle of the time, which is depicted here, right, with the belt buckle 1950s Hereford cattle. So he went through a test and he cut a grand total of 162 head of cattle that looked like that at that time, of which only 12 of them had carcasses that weighed more than 800 pounds, right? And 82 of them had carcasses that weighed less than 600 pounds. Now let me reemphasize, these 162 head are the same 162 head we use today in this math. Does anybody know what the average hot carcass weight in our industry is today? Well over 950 pounds. And that number becomes inaccurate month by month and week by week as we discuss it, because cattle get heavier and heavier and heavier. So by this point in time, hopefully I've reiterated enough that yield grade is really old, it's really outdated, and even from its inception, it was probably inaccurate, right? So today we've advanced a lot, and all of you have heard about camera grading systems and how we utilize cameras to improve the procedures of grading. And camera grading systems have done that. Camera grading systems have increased the accuracy of ribeye measurement. They've increased the accuracy of 12th rib measurements. They've increased the accuracy of all of those measurements that goes into the math. The problem is the math is wrong. So even when we get better at measuring those individual traits, even with technology that has a high level of accuracy and repeatability, we still don't fix the problem. Now, however, this camera grading system has really added to the consistency of quality grade application, which is a really good thing in our industry, but it hasn't fixed the yield grading problem. So again, we've continued to go down this road of trying to fix the yield grade equation, trying to come in and make total adjustments, and we've twisted and turned over the course of about 900 head of cutout data, so 8 times, if you will, the original data used by Charlie Murphy, and the best and the most accurate we can possibly make the equation based on what the camera can measure from the 12th and 13th rib, from the ribeye, is about 63% accurate, okay? About 63% accurate. That's a D, right? Not an A, not a B, not a C, but a D. And some of our students at the university will say D for diploma. I'm good enough, right? But I don't think we can settle at 63% accurate. This is like going to the diesel pump, going to the gas pump, putting in 10 gallons right into your vehicle, and that only being 63% accurate. Are you good with that? Are you good with transacting fuel into your vehicle or anything else that you buy at a 63% level of accuracy? I don't think so. You know, could we make an advancement and make it more accurate in the current time? These data suggest that we could, but we know what's setting in the background is something that's better. And so that's truly what we're waiting on, and that's truly what we're investigating. How good can we be? at accurately measuring red meat yield in these carcasses. Shifting gears just a little bit, what I'm presenting to you here is just from about 2015 to a year or so ago. How have the trends, how have the market signals in the beef industry led us into producing cattle? So what I've tracked here is hot carcass weight, and you see that in the blue line as we've ticked up 880, 885, all the way up today to well over 900, approaching 950 pounds. The other line tracking below it is the percentage of yield grade 4s and 5s. Now, I've just told you how inaccurate yield grade is. So I'm kind of, speaking out of both sides of my mouth here. It's not really accurate. But in general, we still see an increase in fat. That is what we're seeing, and declining red meat yield in carcasses. So much so that we've exceeded not only 25%, but today we're approaching 30% of the cattle population that is of the category of yield grade 4 and 5. Unacceptably fat. It's unacceptable to have nearly a third of the cattle population that is overly fat. Whose fault is that? Well, it's kind of everybody's fault. But primarily it's the market signal. The market signal without yield in the consideration of value, which it's largely out of consideration today. We just incentivize weight by the way of fat. And that's what's happening in our industry. In the interest of marbling, in the interest of carcass weight, we are continually pushing cattle fatter and fatter and fatter over time. Okay? And I think we all understand how that can be and how that is a problem. And this is because of the incentive for quality grade, the shortage of cattle, supply and demand, lack of supply plays an enormous role in this. Packers are desperate for cattle of any type and kind, and they're desperate for hot carcass weight and marbling. And as a result, they've disregarded many of their disincentives in the way of yield grade 4 and 5 discounts out of their grid-based program. They're giving a laxed approach, right? They're not applying yield grade 4 and 5 discounts the way that they should to appropriately incentivize leaner cattle. Now I'm going to go back into kind of how we started in this space. Back in about 2019, we started this phenotype study, as we called it, and at that time we were working really heavily in this beef on dairy space. So we did beef on dairy everything at that point in time. That was the hot topic that we could research both on the livestock and the meat science side of things. And ultimately we figured out that these beef on dairy cattle, much to the comments about the Jerseys earlier, were phenomenal eating quality cattle. And in fact, when we started introducing the beef on dairy into our industry in a large number in about 2016 and 2017, we were actually improving quality grade, we were improving eating characteristics, but of major concern was red meat yield. Obviously, slow-growing Jersey, late maturing Holstein cattle that are both inherently light-muscled were expected to influence red meat yield in a very negative way. And to a large extent, they did. They're not heavily muscled enough, although they're pretty lean in general, okay? So we started looking in this population of beef on dairy crossbreds, and we noticed, like on the previous screen, that there was this huge disparity or discrepancy in phenotype for muscularity in these cattle. So we took these contemporary groups, many of these are half siblings of one another, right? We used sires heavily in this scenario. So we've got true contemporary cattle, and we began sorting them based on their muscle phenotype. So that's what you see on the bottom is the really light muscled dairy appearing cattle on the far left. You see the heavily muscled, more beef appearing cattle on the far right. These are all F1 beef on dairy crossbreds, right? So the genetics are very, very similar. And in the case of the one on the far left and the one on the far right, they are half sibs. They are from the same sire in this study. So we get this natural variation based on the combination of genetics and phenotype. Well, our interest at the time in the beef on dairy population is to understand eating quality characteristics as well as, and primarily, differences in red meat yield between these types of cattle. So we took these types of cattle, and by the way, eating quality did not differ, whether they were skinny and light muscled or heavier muscled. So we had no change in eating quality. So that said, well, why not? Let's just make them better then, right, if they're going to eat the same. But they did have changes or differences in red meat yield at the packing plant, which is ultimately where they ended up. Interestingly enough, at arrival in the feedlot, at about an 850-pound stage, at re-implant, 150 days into that, and then at harvest, these cattle weighed the same, regardless of what they look like over there on the left. The weights of those cattle were the same, which is just emphasizing that they were partitioning or prioritizing weight in different ways. Those lighter conforming or lighter muscled animals were prioritizing skeletal growth. Their mass was in frame score. It was in skeletal, literally bone weights of those cattle, and in some ways visceral weights of those cattle as well. And as we moved down to those earlier maturing types, those more beef types, they were prioritizing two things, fat and muscle in the form of carcass weight. So kind of interesting growth dynamics there that we can reason into retrospectively. Ultimately, what we figured out in this study is even though those cattle, as represented on the top there, fully dairy type, those are the skinny ones, all the way over to the right, fully beef type, those are the thick-looking beef cattle types, those muscling scores were different. That's how we put them into the categories, so there's no surprise there. We went light muscled to heavy muscled. The problem is in the second line. The second line shows that whether they looked extremely light muscled, like a Jersey, or whether they looked decently heavily muscled, like an Angus, okay, they had the same ribeye area. The only trait in the yield grade equation that directly compensates for muscling is ribeye area. And what I showed you here is, regardless of what they look like, regardless of how heavily muscled they were, ribeye area was not different. What does this say? Ribeye area doesn't work. That should be a big letdown for anyone in the room that ever chose a bull based on a ribeye area EPD. It just doesn't work. Now, it worked for grid-based marketing because ribeye area was adding in a positive way to your yield grade, so you were potentially getting paid more for ribeye area. The problem is ribeye area will not translate to true red meat yield difference. Even though the animal is clearly heavily muscled, even though the round and the hindquarter and even the chuck of the animal is more heavily muscled, ribeye area tells us really nothing about it. And so we hosted a symposia, a learning event similar to this, where we were trying to get really creative and have a big impact. So what we did is we went into a feedlot pen in the high plains of Texas. We found two contemporary steers here. In fact, these two contemporaries came from the same dairy, right, and have very similar genetics on the dam side. They're closely related on the sire side, but they came out of the same feedlot pen. So what we did is we took an ultrasound machine, we sorted them phenotypically, took an ultrasound machine, and then tried to find two steers within that pen that had basically the same level of back fat, the same ribeye area, the same mature weight or same weight of those animals, and then we happened to get lucky that they actually had a very similar quality grade. The point is that the yield grade characteristics of these two animals is nearly identical. But visually speaking, they couldn't be more different, right? So even though ribeye area and fat thickness and theoretically carcass weight was held constant, the shape and the muscle pattern and the hindquarter muscling and the forequarter muscling in these cattle was largely different. So we harvested these animals, we eviscerated them, we kept all of their hide on, obviously. We put them on these metal frames and we froze them. These were our frozen steers, and we kept them for about 1.5 years until they really started to stink, and then we disposed of them. But this was a really, really impressionable moment for our people at our convention, because they were able to see up close and personal how these animals were prioritizing weight and prioritizing composition, and how it was completely independent from ribeye area or any of the other yield traits. So ribeye area as a single factor in the yield grade equation across about 900 head of cutout data explained 3%. So worse than the 4% I was talking about earlier. But as a single factor, it explains 3% of the change in red meat yield. It doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work. So we've progressed well beyond 1958, 1962, where perhaps at that time there was a decent relationship between ribeye area and total muscling, to today where there's essentially none. What these data say is we can't just rely on ribeye area, we have to look at the whole carcass. That makes sense. How many of you have chosen ribeye area EPDs and produced bulls and calves and others with no ass, no round? Anybody seen that? Any show of hands? Anybody ever seen an Angus or otherwise bull with big ribeye area statistics and has no true muscling? Yeah, we've propagated that. We've created that by single trait selecting for muscling on the basis of a one-dimensional or two-dimensional measurement without any really regard for full muscling in those cattle. So this is really a common sense story. We're going to move away from a single trait. We're going to look holistically at cattle and try to better understand where muscling really is. So how do we conduct these tests? We take carcasses into a plant, we cut them apart. We cut them apart, we weigh every piece, including every piece of trim, every piece of fat, and every piece of bone, and we ultimately come down to an entire comprehensive composition of these animals. So we're looking at them with a knife and a scale or a scalpel and a scale, and we're getting very, very close through these tests to what we actually see coming into the boxes or coming through the plant. What you see rotating there on the right is a three-dimensional image. This was our first attempt at getting a more holistic measurement of muscle, a more holistic measurement of yield, and we're still writing this concept. So it made sense to us that replacing ribeye area with a 3D image made a whole lot of sense, because now we're measuring round and we're measuring chuck and we're measuring the middle meats of the animal in all of those dimensions. What ultimately you see here, as I try to back this up, is we transition from what you expect to see in a carcass 3D to an immense amount of data, okay? And so today's computer software programs, statistical programs, and yes, even artificial intelligence, right? And I'll tell you, you guys, algorithm in 1958, that's artificial intelligence. We're using mathematics to predict outcomes, even though it was, 5 factors. It was still the earliest form of AI. We've just coined this term AI today, but we've been using algorithms for decades, right, to predict the weather and red meat yield in cattle. It's just more advanced now. We can handle more data. But ultimately, what you see in this three-dimensional image are all these dots and triangles and shapes. Those are all data points in space that help to construct that image, which means that every single point, and there are tens of thousands of them in every one of these images, are measurable. Point A to point B times 10,000, right? And then A, B, C, D to E to F, making the curve or the shape of a carcass, all measurable. So we can take all of these data points and we can measure volumes, masses, lengths, widths, etc. So just let your imagination go as to how advanced we can get and how well we can measure these carcasses. Well, in the earliest development of the 3D of the carcass, we found that we could develop models that were not confounded, that were not artificially creating accuracies, explaining somewhere in the 90% range. That's an A, right? We're getting A's now on our tests, so we're in this 90% level of explanatory value for 3D and true red meat yield. Well, we like 91%, we like 96%, that shows great promise. That says we can probably develop 3D images to measure yield in carcasses. But it fails in comparison to this next set of data that I'm going to show you. And this is a CT scanner. Many of us call it a CAT scanner. Some of us have probably made a few trips through these CAT scanners, right, in our lifetime. And so this is an X-ray machine. This X-ray machine takes slices of X-rays, 1 millimeter in thickness, throughout the entire carcass. So what we ultimately get from that, and as you can see on this 3D round, see the slices? You guys see kind of the gray lines in that? Hopefully you can. Those are the 1 millimeter slices put back together. So we can take those individual slices and we can reconstruct those into a three-dimensional image. So that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking the 1 millimeter slices and we're putting them back together, okay? When we do that, we can differentiate tissue types, muscle, fat, and bone, as you see here. White bone, red muscle, and yellow fat. Not only can we do that on the entire round, but we can do it on the entire carcass, and we can do it as much or as little as we want in every part of the carcass. So you can see we partially added the fat back. We've added all of the muscle. So what this says is with a CT scanner, now we can know when we CT scan a carcass what percentage bone it is, what percentage muscle it is, and what percent fat it is. In our work to this point, what we have found is we, humans, with scalpels and scales, can't match the accuracy of the CT scanner. So it's reversed. It's back on us. Like, we once compared yield grade to our ability to cut carcasses and weigh them. Now we can't match the technology. The technology is better than we are. It is near perfect, right, in its ability to measure these compositional differences. The way that it works looks something like this. On the cone on the left, that's a CT scan. That is the bore. That is the hole in the CT scanner that's traveled the entire length of the beef that we put through it. Then we start differentiating or separating the individual 1 millimeter pixels. Most of us are familiar with pixels now. In this case, pixels are 1 millimeter cubes. Okay, so every cube is then separated based on density as bone, fat, or muscle. So that's what it comes down to. Legos, grandkids, kids have Legos. Somebody done a paint by number picture, you know, paint the ones red, paint the twos white, paint the threes yellow. That's literally how this works. On a 1 millimeter cube, it knows the density of it. When it knows the density of it, it paints it the color. And in this case, the color is muscle, fat, or bone. So that's the level of accuracy or granularity we get. So it builds the Lego round based on the color of those Legos, muscle, fat, or bone. That's the most, I think, common way I can describe that. We call these Hounsfield units coming out of X-ray, and they ultimately translate to density. Luckily for us, luckily for the medical industry, muscle, fat, and bone densities are differentiatable. They're very different. So ultimately we get these very cool looking pictures. You can still see the slices, one slice at a time, through these rounds of beef, and ultimately we can differentiate those tissue types. This is the next step, however. So now not only we know muscle, fat, and bone, but now we can use advanced artificial intelligence models to train the CT data as to what muscles are what. And in this case, we can differentiate the round knuckle from the inside round, or what we call the top round, from the bottom round. So what we're working on now is cutting the carcass like we would do with a knife, but instead we're cutting it with data. So now not only are we going to be able to say how much muscle, fat, and bone is there, but we're literally going to be able to tell you how much the inside round weighs, how much the knuckle weighs, how much the ribeye roll weighs, how much the brisket weighs, based on that. So now we have a very, very clear picture of what red meat yield is and what cutout value is in these carcasses. And you can see this in a cross-sectional image as well, how we're able to differentiate those individual muscles, which translates to differences in individual saleable cuts. The next coolest part is, in our industry, we are very well known for trimming to different levels. Some cuts we sell at a 1/2 inch of fat, some cuts we sell at a 1/4 inch of fat, Some cuts we sell at a 0 inch of fat. In this case, we can trim them to those levels of fat with CT data. So not only do we have what those products weigh, but now we have at each product what it weighs at every single fat trim level. So we end up with this factorial opportunity, this exponential opportunity within a carcass to say, this carcass is worth anywhere from point A to point B in value, based on how we cut it, how we trimmed it, et cetera. So we have thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of iterations of what the carcass is worth. It's kind of crazy, right, in what we can do. And the packers, and I know that might be a bad word for some of you in here, but the packers now have the ability to optimize this carcass. Now they know, hey, this carcass needs to be cut in this fashion to optimize value. Hopefully that value translates back upstream to producers, right? And even someday they might use robots. Let me back up. Someday they will use robots, not might, they will, using these types of data, X-ray types of data, to guide robots, right, to cut carcasses accurately and infinitely to its highest level of value. So what are we doing? I've showed you the scan of one round. I'm proud to say now we're running up and down the road with this unit. This is a semi-trailer that has a CT scanner in it. Now, we didn't invent this concept because CT trailers like this run up and down the road to military bases, prisons, rural areas, and all sorts of things every day of the year to scan people in areas or in places where there's not a hospital with a CT scanner, okay? So this existed, this package existed. The difference is now is we own one with the largest bore opening that they make. So a very large, it has a 36-inch opening, the one that we own, so that a carcass can pass through it. And we have successfully passed up 225 carcasses through our machine and successfully scanned those carcasses. We're on our way to 600, okay, across the industry to build enough data to see how accurate, how repeatable, and how well related these data are to true cutout value. So this is the project or the study that Gordon was speaking of. It's a massive undertaking. It takes us about 45 students to go into these plants over the course of a day or a couple of days to deconstruct these carcasses with a knife and a scale. And actually all they're doing is weighing what the plant workers are doing. So we're just capturing the weights. The plant workers are still cutting. But we're trying to relate all of that data back to CT. So we held our breath for a long time. We made a big investment, nearly $1 million in one of these units to go up and down the road, genuinely not knowing if it would work. But it did, and it does. And we're a couple hundred head into this study. We have several hundred head, even thousands of more to go before we're done with this work. But this shows that this is coming, okay? This shows that this is coming. What does that mean for you? It means that genetically and in management, you're going to have to start considering what red meat yield might look like in the future. And the best thing I can tell you after what I've just told you is it's not going to be ribeye area alone. We're going to have to start selecting genetics for ribeye area, marbling ribeye area, and total conformation for muscling. That's where we're headed, okay? How do we do that? There are tools like this, which is Sizar. That is a radar, millimeter radar system where you can pass cattle through a chute. It builds a three-dimensional shell around the live cattle. There is predictive capacity here. On the live animal running through the chute, we can get about 64% accurate. Pretty good. Pretty good on a live animal trying to translate what is going to hang on the hook. This is just one example of the types of technologies that are being developed or have been developed to do this. Okay. Now I'm going to switch gears here, and I'm going to talk about efficiency, because I know that's the general theme of this conference year over year. I want to show you some interesting data. So this is me throwing grenades, okay? I'm just chunking those out there to help you think and digest on those some. This is some historical data from 2019 to 2023 that shows how much back fat it required for the average carcass to achieve a 500 unit of marbling level. 500 units of marbling is certified Angus beef. 500 units of marbling is average choice, not low choice, but average choice. This is a premium target level of marbling. By the way, if you're still just trying to produce low choice cattle, you're way behind, right? Money made today is not in producing choice cattle. 83% or more of today's cattle grade choice. So if you have choice grading cattle, you're just like 83% of the rest of the people in this room, okay? But if you're producing premium choice cattle, then you're in the 30th percentile, 35th percentile, right? And if you're in prime, you're in the top 10%. So you need to be pursuing these higher levels of marbling. So we've set this threshold not at low choice like we did for decades, but now at average choice. And it says that on average, the cattle graded in the United States, and there's 2.2 million head of cattle in each one of these years that we have here, the average one in 19 required 46 hundredths of an inch, then 44 hundredths of an inch in 2020, 39 in 2022, and 39 in 2023. The good thing is it's getting better in the sense that it requires a little bit less fat year over year, indicating perhaps that genetics are improving even year over year for marbling propensity at lesser amounts of fat. And what I'm here to tell you is we want less fat at the same or greater levels of marbling. There's no doubt about that. We need efficiency for marbling in our data. Ultimately, if we feed those cattle to 6600s, they have essentially stopped producing marbling. That's where these data begin to increase, but at a decreasing rate, meaning that we don't have any business feeding these cattle much over 6500s. And we certainly don't have any business feeding them over 9/10 of an inch of fat. Now those cattle, those 29% of cattle that are yield grade 4s and 5s are over an inch of fat, most all of them. So we've got nearly a third of the population of cattle that are totally disregarding this concept, right? We're just feeding them into oblivion of fatness, which is horribly inefficient. One of my coworkers at Texas Tech did this study where she's looking at, actually it's just a retrospective analysis of some data. Her and a guy named Mike Gallion, which is a long-standing, well-respected nutritionist in our field, did this retrospective study and looking really at 180 days on feed versus 220 days on feed. So a 40-day differential in feed, because this is the tendency of our industry. These data were done almost a year ago, and guess what we've done? We went from 210, 220 days to 240 days. So we just continue to feed them more, right? We just feed them more and more and more in the interest of weight and a lack of incentive for yield premium and or discount. Ultimately, an additional 42 days on feed, which is what she's shown here, 180 to 222 days on feed, we see what we gain. Those cattle eat more, about 0.2 pounds more on a daily basis. They gain less. They're becoming less efficient because they're producing fat instead of muscle. They do gain body weight and carcass weight in any metric you'd like to look at it. Their dressing percentage, so the proportion of their carcass hanging in the cooler, gains about a point. They gained 1/10 of an inch of fat, 12 points, in other words, 12% more of those cattle grading choice. Yield grade went up, percentage 4s and 5s went up 10%, and empty body fat went up 2%. So the cattle are getting heavier, they're getting fatter, and they're putting on more marbling. And that is really the incentive, right, for the additional days on feed. Here's the problem. In those 42 days, those cattle accrued, they built 11 times more fat than they did muscle. We've essentially only put fat on those cattle. So that weight gain, that 85 pounds of carcass, almost exclusively fat, right, in that accumulation. Something that we don't really want. In that 40-day window, they also gained about 40 points in marbling. In other words, they went from small 50 to small 90. It's a change. Marbling increased. I'm a meat scientist. 40 units of marbling, negligible in those cattle from an eating quality standpoint. So we didn't really change the eating quality of those cattle, but we changed the economic performance of those cattle by pushing more of them into a choice or premium choice category. So this is a market signal that we struggle with, ultimately a market signal that's telling us to make cattle heavier and fatter. Okay? We required 42 bushels of corn in those first 180 days on feed. In the additional 42 days, we required an additional 11 bushels of corn. If we take that down to equivalents of water, it costs us 45,200 gallons of water per head just for the corn. Not the forage in the diet, not the water consumed by the animals, but on a per head basis, 45,000 gallons of water, okay? Not only that, but we took incentive away from carbon credit, right? We produced more CO2, more methane over that same time period. Pardon me for speeding up through this as I've run out of time, but ultimately these cattle have become more inefficient, quite literally because fat, from a caloric standpoint, is twice as expensive as lean, right? It takes twice as many calories to produce fat as it does lean. So as we accrue 11 times more fat than we do protein, that becomes considerably more costly in building those animals. That's why average daily gain goes down. That's why red meat yield goes down with it, right? And we're losing efficiency in this model. What do these data say? Yield grade doesn't work, okay? In the last 42 days, we add 80 pounds of fat per head of animal, a $46 value. It cost us $60 to produce it, but we got paid $46 for it. So evidently we're okay with losing about $14 a head, even at elevated tallow values, because once upon a time they said, well, the reason we're producing more fat is because they're paying us for it. And we've increased tallow price. Yeah, we did. Not enough. Cost us 60, they paid us 46. That's a good deal, right? No, not at all. So even the math didn't work out on that. We cost 45,000 gallons of water. We produce more CO2 and more methane over the course of that feeding period. Operational cost increased because it takes much longer to chill fat than it does lean. More water, more energy. Think about it. We produced fat to make a carcass harder to chill, right? We chilled fat that we're going to cut off and heat back up and turn into tallow, right? So we're double negatives here in the way that we're moving and producing more fat from a resource cost, an energy cost, a labor cost. We don't need more fat in our industry. We need more marbling. Don't catch me dead not saying that. The reality is we need more genetics for marbling that put marbling in more efficiently with higher levels of red meat yield. We don't need to put more fat on the carcass like above 6/500ths or certainly 9/10ths just for fun. Okay, we need to get that under control. Ultimately, with 3D imaging, CT technology, which is what's coming, we will be able to give individual data back on individual animals, which ultimately translates to genetic progress, right? The ability to make genetic progress with individual animal data for saleable yield or red meat yield. There's so much power and capacity in that moving forward. Ultimately, this should result in a more efficient animal being produced and being incentivized throughout our industry, more propensity for marbling, greater red meat yield, reduced days on feed, lesser water use, more ergonomic friendly carcasses and cattle within the plant, so on and so forth, right? So will this create a paradigm shift? If it works, it will. I think if we look down the road 5 to 10 years, cattle will look different as a result. Guess what? We're 3 years, maybe less, maybe as much as 5 years, but maybe 3 years or less of you getting paid for cattle on this type of system. What does that mean? You already bred those cows. You're too late. You already bred cows that could potentially have their offspring, their progeny, marketed and incentivized in a different way. So we have to start responding to these changing signals in the sense that, yeah, we need to pay attention to ribeye area, but maybe more importantly, we need to pay attention to total muscularity and conformation on these cattle with it. We need to continue to pursue efficiency by adding muscle to cattle. Adding muscularity cattle in a terminal sense makes them more efficient. Of course, we have to balance that with maternal fat, right? Because cows need fat to maintain on-range operations. So it's always a balance. But on the terminal side, the sire side in particular of this discussion, we need greater red meat yield, we need to maintain marbling, and we need to become more efficient. I'll stop there and take a question or two if we have time for it. Right here.
As a seed stock producer, we're currently ultrasounding on the farm for ribeye area in order to make selection.
Yep.
How practical will something be to measure total red meat yield on live animals on the farm?
You've nailed it. So the question is, we've measured ribeye area with an ultrasound machine, which has become seemingly doable, plausible, efficient. If we don't have ribeye area to rely on anymore on the farm, how do we then begin to measure red meat yield or genetics for red meat yield? At this point in time, your best tool is your eyes, right? Measuring these cattle for total conformation for muscling. We are simultaneously working on live animal phenotype work that is trying to relate what we see in the CT scanner to the live animal. That may be ultrasounds of different parts of the animal, like ultrasound of the round. For example, the semitendinosus in the round is a very cylindrical round muscle that has potential to coincide with, to support ribeye area measurements for muscularity. It may be something like a tape measurement of hind shank or foreshank. Those are parts of the carcass that are very true to red meat yield differences. However, we haven't found the right answer yet. We will, as an entire research community, as an entire industry, not just Texas Tech, but everyone, will begin to look at these things moving forward to come up with that answer. SIZE-R, the chute-based radar system, holistically measures. That is not yet commercially available, but it's really close. Of course, your phones, all the 3D images I showed you on the screen were taken with an Apple iPad. So you already have the capacity, probably in your pocket, or someone in your operation does, to capture a three-dimensional image, or even a straight-on image that can then be used to create some level of objective measurement. Your question is perfect. We need to work on it. We need to support the cattlemen in saying these are the types of traits you're looking for. But ultimately, breed associations already have for a couple of years, based on these discussions, have already started to measure and try to produce metrics in the form of an EPD or GEPD based on red meat yield. So that's coming. Like if you're using AI, if you're buying registered sires or sires with data, those breed associations are desperately working to create metrics for this red meat yield change. So hopefully that's coming sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Other questions? Got time for a couple more questions. Got mics floating back there. I know we've stimulated a lot of interest here, and if you have anything you'd like to ask Dale, go ahead. He won't be here at the end, probably, so go ahead.
So, obviously, back in COVID, there was a lot of direct-to-beef sales. I can be loud, but that's okay. Thank you. Ooh, that's really loud. But now, we get a lot of people that we want grass-finished beef, and has there been any research about? They claim that there's like vitamin synthesis, it affects the meat, omega-6s, all this stuff. Is there any backing to that, or is this conversation, where does that play into that conversation?
Yeah, the first, I would acknowledge, yes, there has been an increase in wanting to buy locker beef, locally produced, right, to make sure we don't run out of hamburger or toilet paper or anything else if another COVID comes. So that has been a very strong area of emphasis. Grass-fed in particular, my first question is, have you ever actually eaten grass-fed? Like, that's question number one. Are you going to get it back and like the taste of grass-fed? Because it is different. It is different because the fatty acid composition and the lean composition does change as a result of grass finishing systems. Or maybe I should say grain finishing changes the composition away from grass-fed. Omega-3, omega-6s, the ratios of omega-3, omega-6 does change. We generally have a positive change in omega-3 to omega-6 ratio with grass-fed. It's negligible, right? The amount of change is so minimal from a health standpoint that it really doesn't matter. But if it makes them feel good and it pushes them towards grass-fed, why not sell them grass-fed? The trick is that in a fattened steer or heifer in a feedlot that has more marbling, more fat, they actually have more omega-3s, right, as a total. And most health professionals simply recommend more omega-3s in the diet. So it's kind of a catch-22. You get more omega-3s from a grain-finished animal, but you get a more desirable ratio of those two fatty acids in grass-fed, but probably not enough to substantiate a true health claim. I don't say that to discourage someone from selling grass-finished beef, however. If that's what the consumer wants and they're eating beef instead of chicken, go for it, right? But no, there's not a whole lot to substantiate other than those cattle are generally leaner and could be more healthful as a result. There's really not much health benefit from a grass-finished standpoint. Yeah.
Dr. Johns. Wait.
Do you foresee any time when a CT scanner would actually be used in a commercial plant?
Well, we're using them right now. I think it's a great question. The true answer should be, with the current state of the technology, we cannot scan 350 head an hour or 400 head an hour. So at the current state of the technology, it will not be the every carcass measurement. That's a great point. So we're developing CT scan as what we call a gold standard measurement. So that will replace the scalpel and the knife. That will allow for other technologies that can operate at 400 head an hour to be developed using the CT data. So the CT data will train the faster technologies. At this point in time, it appears that 3D imagery of a carcass in some form or fashion, whether it's taken with an iPhone or a network of cameras or a millimeter radar system, that will be the earliest tool used to measure every carcass. So the CT scanner will train the 3D image. The 3D image will be employed on every carcass. A 3D image can be captured instantaneously on a carcass within nanoseconds, actually. So millionths of a second, billionths of a second, it can actually capture that image. And then that data can be processed quickly enough to grade individual carcasses. Perfect question. CT is not fast enough. CT is accurate. It will be used to develop other technologies until CT is fast enough, right? Which is a possibility in the long run, yeah.
Your questions have been literally fantastic, and this is such a unique presentation. If there's one more, we'll take one more. Got it right over here. Someone get the microphone here.
So the intent is the end goal for an industry standpoint of what we're producing as producers. Is the end goal going to be to replace yield grade 1 and 2 ideal with a red meat yield, I guess, premium advantage eventually, right? Because we've understood from what I gather from this presentation is yield grade 1s and 2s in the yield grade system right now is completely inaccurate. And so we're getting premiums based on something. Is our goal or towards what we need to work for is increasing our genetics base for red meat yield, because eventually we're going to get a premium for that advantage.
That's right. Yeah, I like the way you pose it. In most talks, candidly, I give, it's like, so you're telling me we're creating a discount? Yeah, by the way of a premium. And so the glass half full is premium. There will be premium on a continuum of red meat yield. And I don't know exactly what that metric will look like, if it'll be a percentage of red meat yield, if it'll be a box dollar value, you know, whatever that evolves into. But there will be a numerical metric. I believe it will be continuous, not categorical like yield grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I think we'll have more of a continuous scale, and there will be a par, more than likely, and then premiums above the par and discounts below the par. So your advantage, hopefully, in being aware of this, is if we can start making genetic progress to be above par, then that translates to premiums. Of course, half, more than likely, or maybe less if the packers are nice, right, below the par will begin to receive discounts. But the whole point is we want to be above par. And in general, we need to start making greater selection towards total carcass muscling without sacrificing marbling. I cannot say that enough times. Marbling will remain king in valuing beef carcasses on a per pound basis, okay? So don't deviate from that. Luckily, we talked about this at dinner last night. Some of the leading experts in the genetic space, including those that oversee all of the genetic databases at Angus, indicate that selection for red meat yield is not directly antagonistic to marbling. In other words, there are sires, there are genetics that do both. But what this does is it drives our industry to those top percentiles of genetics that can and do both within this system. So it's that top tier of genetics that provides more marbling and potentially provides more red meat yield. But marbling and red meat yield or total red meat are not antagonistic to one another, right? So that is a very positive thing in genetics. We can actually pursue both, but we have to actively do that. And before we can actively do that, the breed associations are going to have an accurate metric outside of ribeye area of what true muscling is. And they're working on that, trust me. Angus, Hereford, Charolais, Limousin, all of them, I could keep listing them, are actively pursuing these metrics for their breeds. And I know those are all purebreds, but ultimately we use them in crossbreeding terminal scenarios. Yeah.
Dale, this has just been a fantastic presentation. I want to wind up with just one comment, and you can add to it. I think maybe the most important, all we've learned about red meat yield is so important here, but this efficiency thing, in the industry, we talk about the importance of measuring feed intake and that kind of thing. We're not going to take anything away from that, but the efficiency that Dr. Woerner has described to us this morning that we lose by getting cattle too fat, I would say, Dr. Woerner, that we are losing more efficiency from what you described than we are the fact that cattle overeat.
No doubt. Yeah, the inefficiency in management for producing gross amounts of fat is the most inefficient thing we do in our industry. Yeah. On the terminal stage for certain, yeah.
Let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Woerner for being here this morning. Thank you so much, Dale. This is fantastic.